Welcome, Phil, to episode one of Walking in a Garden. From the quote, rather be a gardener, rather be a warrior in the garden and not a gardener in a war. So thank you very much for being my very first guest and the very special guest you are. For those listening, Phil and I grew up in the same neighborhood in South Africa, in close proximity to each other, and we would probably most likely run into each other on our bicycles while we rambled around the neighborhood and did all the boy type things. And then I've bumped into him a few times over the years in various strange places because he's made a career of working with NGOs and with sustainability projects and food security projects across Africa and the Middle East. And Phil and I were talking yesterday, and he started talking a little bit about his recent experience where he visited Israel. And I found that fascinating, and I asked Phil, and he very kindly agreed to come on and to talk a little bit about his experiences and about his thoughts about the region and what he thinks happening. And he is eminently qualified to do so. And I look forward to our discussion. Phil, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, John. It's actually an honor to be your first guest, and I feel right at home as an avid gardener and as someone who spent a lot of the last 25 years working, as you rightly said, across Africa and the Middle East with community resilience and especially with reconstruction of post-conflict communities. So I feel right at home.
Excellent.
As I mentioned to you, I've just returned from a short trip to Israel to visit friends and offer condolences and support to some people who have recently experienced trauma and grief. One of my colleagues who I worked with in Ethiopia and Tanzania was a victim of the hostage taking. She sadly lost her husband, son-in-law, and a nephew in the attack on Kibbutz Be'eri, and she and her sister and 4 children were actually taken into Gaza. I'm very happy to say that they are now back, but of course, facing the heartache and trauma of both the people that they've lost and those that they had to leave behind who are still there. And then I have another friend who is serving high-ranking officer in the IDF, whose son was killed on the evening of the first day of the attack, leading one of the groups that spontaneously reacted to coincidentally the same kibbutz Be'eri, and he and one of his fellow comrades from their special forces unit were killed rescuing hostages. I believe that they'd already managed to rescue 30 hostages from the assailants by the time this had happened. And I went there to show my solidarity and to extend some words of sympathy to my friends who've been so directly affected by the tragic events. I purposefully don't want to share my opinions and views about the rights and wrongs of the situation in Israel. There are people much wiser than me, better placed to comment on those issues. But my visit there did get me thinking about some broader strategic issues and lessons we can take away from the aftermath of the debacle that unfolded.
Yes.
When I wrote my master's thesis about People's War in the 1980s, I didn't anticipate the extent to which asymmetrical warfare would throw up completely new configurations, or perhaps I should say modern configurations of People's War that move way beyond its original Maoist roots.
Yes.
On observing from the sidelines as an armchair warrior and a gardener, the
Yes.
ongoing wars in Ukraine and Israel, I began to see an interesting suggestion that democratic societies with conscript armies and an armed and motivated population responded better to asymmetrical warfare than
Yes.
did highly centralized modern Western countries, where there was a
Yes.
strict separation between the military caste and reservists and
Yes.
the broader public. And that
Yes.
these societies were showing a high degree of flexibility and
Yes.
greater resilience in dealing with the complexities of asymmetrical warfare. Both Ukraine and Israel have raised interesting and thought-provoking questions about the Western dependence on professional militaries,
Standing arms.
while
Yes.
including reservists, do not reflect the wide spectrum of our modern society, and importantly, don't capture the talents of
Yes.
those
Absolutely.
people in civil society that fall outside of the military caste. The Ukrainian forces that have so heroically resisted the juggernaut of the Russian army are made up of school teachers, lawyers, farmers, office workers, and importantly, both men and women.
Correct.
And they've brought with them skills and a lateral thinking, which they bring from the vast range of civilian occupations that has brought innovation and groundbreaking responses using very meager resources,
Yes.
and that this phenomenon is something which I think we need to look very carefully at. They have reshaped small infantry tactics in integrating civilian technology
Yeah.
with modern Western infantry weapons,
Yes.
including manpads, anti-tank guided weapons, drones, to name a few. And they've
Exactly.
taken, they've transplanted software and manufacturing techniques like 3D printing,
Mm.
and they've almost bypassed the huge incompetent monolithic military procurement systems which most Western countries have, which
Exactly.
sees unacceptable lead times between R&D and deployment in the field, and a huge disconnect, as you know, between the quality of equipment delivered and the price paid by the taxpayer.
Correct. Yeah.
So these are really interesting things, and I would think it's safe to say that they're punching way beyond their weight when you
Mm.
think about the fact that it's essentially a coalition between reservists, volunteers, and then a core of professional, highly trained officers,
Yes.
technical support, and obviously very well trained and experienced special forces units. But I
Yes.
think that there's a bigger issue here about democracy, and as our democracies have matured, there's been a tendency for people to emphasize those elements of rights and democracies that
Hmm.
almost view the military and the security role of the state as an embarrassing obligation.
Almost
And
as subordinate.
it's allowed
Subordinate.
people to
Yeah.
occupy a false space where they disengage from those realities. And
Yeah.
you have this very dangerous separation,
Yeah.
and you end up with, a situation where you can have a parliament like the French parliament or the
Mm.
German a Bundestag, or even at some stages in its history, the House of Commons, where only a very, very tiny number of lawmakers have actually seen military service.
Yes.
And it's a very dangerous thing for democracy. And while I'm
Yeah.
not suggesting that you need to break down the firewalls between the military and a civil society. I do think that there's a strong connection.
Yes.
So that's really, it was against that background that I started to think about what I was seeing in Israel.
Okay.
And I, that, John, is what I'd like to talk about today.
Philip, fantastic. One of the things that has been bothering me since the 7th is a lot of the discussion that we've been seeing in the media across the spectrum that is throwing all kinds of words around and epithets and what have you. And I've visited Israel a number of times, and I remember something that struck me is just how multicultural and multi-ethnic they are, first of all, which was surprising to me the first time I visited in the very early 90s. And second of all, just how racially diverse they are. And people who
Yes.
don't actually know anything other than what they are being force fed don't seem to understand that it's probably it is a surprisingly multicultural society, and it's also a surprisingly liberal society. And I think maybe if we can touch on that at some stage. I mean, you could even describe a large parts of the society there, particularly towards the south, nearer to Gaza, as being progressive liberals. And so I'd like you to touch on that when you discuss that and how that's affected, the way that people are reacting there.
John, I think the point that you've raised about the sort of multicultural and diverse nature of Israeli society, and the fact that that's reflected in the IDF is so apparent. When you walk around on the streets in Israel, but sadly also when you look at the profiles of the 90 soldiers who've already been killed during the operation within Gaza. And I mean, there's obviously the full spectrum from Druze colonels, Bedouin majors, some obviously quite Orthodox Jewish soldiers. And then now I see there was, I think, the second Ethiopian Jewish soldier who was a special forces staff sergeant serving in one of the elite units who was killed the day before yesterday. Obviously, this is rooted in the sort of fascinating history of Israel. And one of the things that older Israelis have told me about was that prior to the Yom Kippur War, there was a very strict, and it was identified as a problematic subdivision in Israeli society within the IDF between people who were essentially either came from Western countries or were from families that came from Western countries who populated the Air Force, the tank units, and all of those areas where there was a lot of technology and education was important. And then the special forces units, the infantry units, the scouts, the trackers, all of those sort of units. And of course, a lot of the intelligence units were overwhelmingly staffed by people who came from or were from families from the hundreds of thousands of Sephardic Jews that were expelled from North Africa and from the Middle Eastern countries, who, to someone like you or I, who is not an Israeli, would look indistinguishable from an Arab. And they range from Yemeni Arabs, who are very, very dark and obviously are closely related to Africa. They live across a tiny stretch of sea. And then, Jewish Israelis that were very light skinned and looked more like the sort of Syrian and northern Arabic peoples who are in close proximity to the Caucasus. So there is this incredible diversity. The IDF has worked very hard on this. They identified that there was a problem because during the Yom Kippur War, there was actually conflict within units between
Yeah.
those people who are described as black Jews and those who are described as white Jews. And there's been a lot of social engineering within the IDF. They've used conscription as a way of nation building.
Yes.
And it's been particularly successful, for instance, with the 70 or 80,000 Ethiopian Jews who were brought in a series of airlifts. That all of them have actually cut their teeth as Israelis by doing their conscription. And this is obviously young men and women. So, there's also a very interesting increasing number of Arabs. So I was told that the latest figures are there are between 2,500 and 3,000 Arab Israelis serving in the IDF. And interestingly, a significant number of them in specialist units like the Golanis, who are the sort of shock troop unit of the IDF. So, I mean, this is a very interesting and it challenges this simplistic narrative that you were talking out there, that it's sort of Israeli Jews fighting Palestinian Arabs. And one of the things that I heard over and over again when I was there, that the 1.8 million Israeli Arabs, and most people don't know that there are almost 2 million Arabs who are full Israeli citizens. We're not talking about Gazans or West Bank Palestinians. These are people who actually live inside Israel and make up, a significant, for instance, percentage of the medical services. So I think close to 50% of doctors, chemists, and nurses in Israel are Israeli Arabs. So it's a very interesting, a very complex society. It's achieved incredible progress when it comes to integrating people, but it also is at the forefront of bringing women into all levels of society. And I mean, as you well know, there's been a huge debate within the IDF about the extent to which women entered combat roles.
Yes.
And I think that the performance of women in the first 24 hours of conflict during this war have significantly strengthened their role within the IDF, because everybody agrees that they performed extremely well.
Yes.
There are limitations which have been, I think, observed in using them inside Gaza.
Yes.
I don't think that the Israeli army wants any more women in the hands of Hamas. And so I think there have been some difficult decisions made. But obviously, as you know, 2/3 of the IDF are being held in reserve on the northern border, because that's where the greatest potential for a real war is. And obviously a very significant number of those units are completely integrated, including armor units and operational units. So very interesting things happening up there. But what I want to do just take a deep dive into is what actually happened on the 7th, because I think it's really important. And I think one sort of needs to take one step back and talk about a couple of things about Israeli society. I mean, you touched on the extent that Israel has a very strong democracy. Its democracy is strong, but it's fractious. There's very, very strong political divides, and it was no more evident immediately before the attack, when there was an unprecedented level of political conflict between civil society organizations, spearheaded largely by military veterans and the ruling coalition. And obviously this year, this high level of protest and the resistance to the government
Political activism.
seemingly was misread by Israel's opponents.
Yeah.
And I think
That's
that
what
they
it's
perhaps took political opposition for disloyalty to the state of Israel. And of course, what we've seen is that even those people who were so harshly critical of what I think, and I'll explain why, is a discredited government, that they've come forward to serve their nation.
Yeah.
Now, what happened before this year was that Israel had gone through a period of relative peace, with no significant conflict. Obviously, a simmering level of instability on the West Bank, and random incidents on the northern border. But there was a level of prosperity, general well-being, and you had a generation of young Israelis who were growing up who had never fought in a proper war before.
Yes.
And this cumulatively led to a feeling in Israel that Israel could take a high road and it could turn its back on its sort of blood-soaked history. And there was this thing that I heard from so many older Israelis, that they had an aspiration that their children grew up in a normal society. And actually this was articulated by one of the previous prime ministers, Olmert, who actually said that Israel needs to sacrifice a lot to make sure that its children can grow up as ordinary people in
Yes.
a global society. And I think that sadly, he and many other Israelis forgot a very famous speech which General Moshe Dayan made at a shiva, which is a memorial service for the head of security in one of the southern kibbutzes, who was killed by people coming across from Gaza in the 1970s. He warned Israelis that the mistake that this particular person had made, who was the head of the volunteer head of security, is that he'd laid down his sword to pick up the plow. And in doing so, he'd forgotten that the price that you have to pay to live on the border with a hostile enemy across the fence is that you have to farm with your plow in the one hand and your sword in the other. And he said to Israelis that Israelis couldn't afford the luxury of ever forgetting that they could never afford to lay down the sword. And I think there was a big problem in the run-up to what happened. And I think the sword, to some extent, had been sheathed. There was a lot of wishful thinking. There was, of course, a reliance on technology. Israel had used its this very clever way in which it uses its conscripts, where it takes conscripts who have specific skills and it deploys them into special units which are responsible for R&D, for IT development. It even has a whole unit that does startups of industries, which use military and civilian economic development. And they'd sort of, were very happy within the bubble that they'd created. And this led to this. I think Israelis have told me that it led to a level of arrogance and complacency, and people actually thought that they started to think they looked across the border and they looked at the people that they were fighting, and their society was moving so far ahead in terms of its values, its prosperity. And I think there was, they they started to underestimate
Yes.
what the people that were across the border. And then the other thing they did was they made a fatal mistake in that they thought that if they diverted the Gazans into what is essentially a criminal economy, that it would absorb them, and that they would become almost the criminality and the corruption which had paralyzed the Palestinian Authority would also paralyze Gaza. So, as you know, that the borders and the restrictions which the Israelis had placed on access and entry into Gaza led to vast smuggling networks. And it's interesting that the origin of a lot of the tunnels, which are now so central to Israel's campaign, was smuggling. And they morphed from that. And obviously what's happened is that, the Hamas has essentially run, sort of a vast criminal welfare state in Gaza, where they have created massive dependency on amongst people by using all of the vast amounts of aid which they've received from the European Union, from other Western countries, and especially from some of the wealthy Gulf states. And you have this very unhealthy situation where the Gazan economy was primarily made up of smuggling and criminality, and then handouts and welfareism, which originated from the Hamas state, because it was a state. And again, as someone who was extremely interested in a people's war, I mean, they really had created true parallel hierarchy of structures in Gaza, which replaced completely the Palestinian Authority, who they had savagely removed and brutally killed. So they had created all of these departments, these spokesmen that you see, the talking heads from the health department and the education department. They all Hamas people, and all of the infrastructure and all of the social structure was essentially absorbed into Hamas. And so it's a very different state and a very different society to the West Bank. And the Israelis, I think, mistakenly thought that they could manage this and just keep it like a pressure cooker. And it obviously turned out to be a massive mistake.
Can I just ask? I just want to put this in a context that I can maybe understand. I think about two things, and I'd just like to hear your reaction. We know what's happening in South Africa with these vast patronage networks and cadre deployment and all of those kind of things, and I think that that's a very close parallel. But to put it in a more sort of an interesting context, to me it feels very much like the old Sicilian mafia in the US that we've seen in movies, the gangster type of thing, where you have to make your bone, so you got to perform some other act that makes you legitimate, and then you get into the organization, and then you got to move through it, and only those people who have worked their way through and have done all kinds of horrible things then get rewarded by giving positions where they can make money, and etc. So what you're saying sounds to me very much like that movie portrayal of the kind of gangster society. Does that make sense? So they've got nothing to do with the formal political structure, and yet they would have an unprecedented amount of influence on local politics, for example. So is this what you're saying, that they're essentially the mafia in the way that they work?
Very much so, John. John, what makes that even more toxic and them more powerful is that they offer an enormous amount of support to families of people who are either in Hamas service, and even more so if they killed in a martyrdom act. And
Yes.
then the families receive this enormous bonus. And
Mm.
then there's a pecking order, because people from martyr families then get priority for all the kinds of things. So absolutely right.
Mm.
It's just like the mafia, but it's obviously it's got elements of Sharia,
Mm.
and things which are embedded in, like a lot of the Abrahamic religions.
Yeah.
And probably I'm going to say something controversial, but most of the Abrahamic religions have an element of small s socialism in them,
Yes.
and it's welfareism, socialism, egalitarianism, but they've also got this thing of, they've just taken charity and they've industrialized it,
Okay.
or or nationalized. But you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. It's
Well,
a
I
terrible
mean,
stranglehold which they have over ordinary people, and one which the Israelis are going to find very difficult to break. And when the Israelis are insistent that they have to break Hamas, and you get all the Western talking heads who say, well, you can't do that, or it's impossible. I think the Israelis understand that you literally do have to break it, because
mm,
its integrity, um, if it survives on any level,
yeah.
it will be an existential threat to Israel, and it will be perpetuated, and it will continue to to threaten Israel.
So,
So, John,
so
this. Sorry, please.
sorry. So here's another example. As you're talking, that I have quite close to where I am here in Panama is the Medellin cartel issue in Colombia, where
Yes.
in the areas where the cartel was active, the people loved the cartel because the streets were clean and the people were fed. There were food supplies to them. All the social services were run by the cartel because it kept the community happy, and they ignored the absolute evil of the impact of what they were doing. And I've been hearing from some friends who've been there over the last year or three, and they're saying that one of the biggest factors in the change of the mindset there is that they have destroyed the poppy fields, replaced them with coffee fields. And if you speak to the local people, they are now they memory holding the fact that there was ever cocaine grown there, poppies grown there. This has always been a coffee field. Never mind that 3 years ago, no, it wasn't. It was a Medellin planted, guarded operation. Now it's like, well, this is how we make our money. And so I think the important lesson touches on something that Musk actually said, which is that you have to various things, but the only way you begin the climb out of the current situation is to make them economically successful. So that whole concept of enlightened self-interest. Does that sort of resonate with how you look at it?
Yes, John. However, there's a huge problem here, because if you look
Mm.
at rural livelihoods,
Yes,
and especially agriculture-based ones,
yes,
you can offer alternatives, and you can encourage people to embrace better ways of doing what they do.
yeah,
However, you can't compete with livelihoods where um, the product which is produced, or the crop which is grown, vastly outperforms anything that they could illegally
yeah,
grow. And I mean, we don't need to look much further than just up the hill from where we grew up, to
yes,
Lesotho, and the Lesotho economy that's so closely linked to the growing of marijuana.
yes, exactly.
I worked on a resettlement project for the extension of one of the dams
Hmm.
in Lesotho, and the developers had to pay compensation for agricultural crops based on yield and worth.
Yes,
And when we took the compensation report to the project sponsors,
yes,
and there were entries which showed that we were obviously, a good marijuana crop was worth 30 or 40 times what a maize crop was.
exactly.
And they said to us, well, we can't morally justify compensating them for the loss of
Yes.
these crops. We ended up having to fudge the issue by describing the crop as irrigated cabbage and pay them out for it. But that
Yeah.
was the reality, was that
Yeah.
nothing we could do. I mean, we could, do the best, roll out the best maize production with the latest cultivars, irrigation with fertilizers, but we couldn't compete with the marijuana.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in these economies, in rebuilding an economy like Gaza, there have to be some paradigm changes, and obviously, smuggling is a consequence of border restrictions, and there is
Yes.
this reality again, which a lot of people aren't aware of, that the Egyptians pathologically hate the Gazans,
Yes.
and they regard the Gazans as a massive security
Yes.
threat because of the insurgency that they're fighting against ISIS
And the Muslim Brotherhood.
in the adjacent area. So
Yeah.
the Gazans are blocked off on the Egyptian border, and the Egyptians keep a stranglehold over what goes through there. And then obviously the Israelis have relaxed the border. They had just issued 18,000 work permits to Gazans to come and work in Israel on the eve of this event.
Yeah.
But going forward, they're going to have to find a way of dismantling Hamas's patronage network, because that's what you're talking about, the mafia style hierarchy.
Yeah.
They're going to have to open up the borders to trade, so that they make smuggling a non-issue.
Yes.
And they're going to have to try and demilitarize it. And all of those are tall orders, because to do that, you need some kind of social fabric or social structure. And unfortunately, through various reasons of history, some things which are the fault of the Israelis and some things which are not their fault, Gaza doesn't have a social structure anymore. It has this mafia hierarchy. But whereas the West Bank still has very strong Arab clans, and if you talk to people from the West Bank, they'll explain to you that the virtual collapse of the Palestinian Authority has meant that the clans and the their justice systems, their mediation systems, which operate within the clans, have reasserted themselves. And they are the things that effectively mean that the West Bank is much more stable, and accounts for the fact that largely up until now, the West Bank hasn't erupted into a full-blown intifada. And I mean, obviously the Israelis have kept the lid on, and they've been taking all the Hamas people out. But in doing so, they've actually created space for the beleaguered Palestinian Authority to reassert itself. So, I mean, these are the kind of things that, need to be looked at. John, I would like to just drill down now into some of the reasons why I think the modern Israeli techno state failed on the 7th of October. So what I saw and heard from everybody that I spoke to, and I spoke to a very wide range of people from different backgrounds and with different experience, but everybody agreed that there was a 48-hour period where the state basically lost control. There was a command and control breakdown. There was a national emergency planning structures breakdown. There was obviously the intelligence failure that we are aware of. There were focused and planned attacks against key infrastructure points, military ones, intelligence ones, and other infrastructure points, including these intelligence hubs, which were down in the south. There was profiling of different communities. I mean, you alluded to the fact that many of the southern kibbutzim
Mm.
are largely made up of people who are more secular in the sense of not being ultra orthodox,
Yes.
but largely people who were regarded themselves as sort of frontiers people who engaged with the Gazans, with the Arabs. Vast majority of them spoke Arabic, and you know the person that was who worked with me, who was an agronomist working in Ethiopia with drought-resistant crops. She was a good example of someone very progressive, left-wing, implacably opposed to the current Israeli government, and chose to live down there in the south because it had a different feel to it. And it's no coincidence that the rave party was happening down there, and it wasn't happening somewhere, you know, in proximity to a part of Israel where there were a lot of religious Orthodox Jews, because obviously they would have been outraged by the kind of things which the young and old Israelis were doing, having a party in the desert. So you know, I think that it's really interesting that Hamas went after those people. I have in the beginning, I strongly suspected that the attack on the rave party was a targeted attack. But everybody that I've spoken to in the intelligence network in Israel says that they believe now that it actually was a target of opportunity.
Okay.
And they've actually go further, and they say that the more they look at it, the more they're realizing that if it hadn't been for the rave party, the main column of Nukba attackers would have penetrated much more deeply into Israel, and they've discovered plans that they intended to symbolically punch right through and link up with the West Bank and make a major political statement about joining Gaza and the West Bank. And it seems as if they became so preoccupied in this sort of wave of slaughter and bloodlust of finding all those poor kids in the desert that actually slowed them down, and they became distracted from their mission. But you know, I don't think that it was completely unintentional that the attack was down there in the south, and that they didn't go and, you know, challenge the sort of crazy Israeli AWB types that are in some of the settler organizations, or the ultra orthodox. They went after, you know, modern liberal secular Israelis. So what happened? First of all, there's now clear evidence that the Border Scouts, which is a unit which is made up of largely women that monitor using screens, cameras, and observation what's happening, had been feeding back a huge amount of intelligence, suggesting that there was going to be some sort of an attack. They'd actually witnessed and seen the construction of a fake kibbutz with a synagogue, a gate with a kibbutz sign on the outside, and Nukba training to assault it and take it over. So on a human intelligence level, they'd escalated that. There'd been a confrontation between their operational officer level and the senior officers over the kind of alarms that they were raising. The second intelligence failure was there was obviously all the signals intelligence coming out of from the monitoring of phones, sensors, and other kinds of means in Gaza. That was also ignored.
Yeah.
Then, remarkably, there's now very strong evidence that the Egyptian defense minister contacted the prime minister's office
Yeah.
and warned them of an attack. He was brushed aside. He then escalated it to actually having some kind of a contact with the prime minister in which he warned him.
Yes.
He was ignored. Then a prominent Israeli journalist who was actually working on a story in Egypt bumped into this Egyptian intelligence minister, and he said to her, "Look, there's something terribly wrong, because I've tried on 2 occasions to reach out to the prime minister's office, and I've been ignored. We have very, very good evidence that Hamas are about to do something big and something bad." She went back, reported it, was also ignored. There are at least 3 studies which have now emerged that were done. One of them 3 years ago, and then 2 of them about a year ago, in which there were scenarios projected, which argued that Hamas was about to do something. And all of these things. So, strategic intelligence. The only thing which we don't know yet, which obviously is going to be a very painful process of unraveling, is why Shin Bet's intelligence, its human informer intelligence network, failed. There seems to have been a huge amount of disinformation, active, carefully managed disinformation, and there seems to have been a lot of operational intelligence discipline within Hamas about this here. But there's indisputably Shin Bet has to answer, and the head of Shin Bet has already indicated that when the war's over, he's prepared to fall on his sword to take responsibility for the failure. So all these things happen, and the Israeli state just falls apart. There's no proper response, and then a whole lot of really interesting things happen. And this is really what I wanted to talk about today, is a remarkable response from ordinary people. So first of all, you've got a combination of veterans, reservists, you've got armed people like kibbutz security, police, border guard, different people. But the whole command and control system fractures. But they get together as individuals, as groups, they start responding. You have got individual serving military commanders at a sort of lieutenant, captain level, who've got military resources like helicopters or armor or drones available, but they're not told how to respond. And because of informal friendship networks, using social media, they're able to say, I've got 4 helicopters, and his mate who's got 3 platoons of paratroopers sitting in their barracks, and they started to respond. They deployed armor, and none of it was actually coming from the formal command and control level. It was being done some incredible things happened. And I mean, there were people, the commanding officer of the South Gaza Brigade was killed leading hostage rescue with 4 other people. I mean, people just grabbed their weapons, shared out whatever ammunition they could, and they tried to fight back. But they were overwhelmed. I mean, there were instances where there were Nukba managed to actually overrun military bases and military commanders were having to call airstrikes in on their own bases,
Yeah.
which is something that no commanding officer ever expects to do. There was again, as this unfolded, there were more and more. Obviously, there were the trained Nukba cadres who were, who'd come in, but then behind them, there were these people who in Arab armies are normally called the Fayadin as opposed to the Mujahideen, who are the sort of rabble, the human locusts that come and rape and pillage. They came pouring through the border. So the people who are trying to assert control were dealing with both trained people who were actually fighting really hard. And my friend's son who was killed, a good example, people who knew what they were doing. They were actually drawing Israeli first responders into a situation where they'd pre-position IEDs, and they were well armed, well equipped. Quite a lot of them were wearing captured Israeli uniforms, and they really knew what they were doing. They had proper targets, and it was only as more and more people started to arrive, because many of the soldiers mobilized themselves. So people would receive a WhatsApp message from a group, and then they would take their kit, jump in their car, and drive to the south and get together. So in this environment, as it reached the end of the first 24 hours, and the mobilization call went out, and all the units started to mobilize. There was this incredible movement of people from their homes in their private vehicles. And from what I've heard, there was 150% mobilization. So there was this incredible response. But you can imagine the chaos of having thousands of people arrive one by one in their private car. The roads were blocked for kilometers around the army bases. It was, people just left their keys in the car and scrambled for mobilization. People had to go and open up all of the stores and draw kit down and then try and move it, because all of the systems broke down. So some units arrived to pick up their kits and found that the kits had already gone because other units had taken it. So there was a need to move a kit around. Also, I mean, the number of soldiers who had first line equipment probably were 100,000, but once you started to reach, a full mobilization, there were guys that were arriving with pretty old kit. So then there was a whole scramble in civilian society to try and make sure that people had proper equipment. So anybody who had equipment at home then bought that in. People started to buy equipment. So the veterans organizations who I spoke to, I mean, they were doing things like buying 200 pairs of sunglasses, or buying decent sleeping mats. Buying better Kevlar high-tech helmets. There was, or they were going to an optics factory that made, military optics. And as they were coming off the production line, people were rushing them in their private cars down to resupply units. There were even people that were using 3D printers at home to make stuff for soldiers. So, for instance, somebody came up with a design for an interface that allowed you to put an adapter inside a PowerPoint in the standard Israeli armored vehicle, which had 4 USB charger points in it. So people could charge all of the modern USB charging equipment using the sort of equivalent of a cigarette lighter that there is in a military vehicle. And the guy who developed it published the plans, and everybody with a 3D printer was making them and rushing them off to distribute them.
Fantastic. I mean, that is just fantastic.
People were rounding up medical kits and medical supplies. And then, of course, because the Israeli army is a volunteer army, huge amounts of food preparation.
Yes.
And with, again, there's all the cultural diversity that you are talking about. There's all different kinds of Israeli food.
Yes.
There's all kinds of different levels of religious observance. Yes. So people were volunteering, and the most amazing thing, I have a friend who is a retired rabbi who survived the Holocaust, who's 87.
Yeah.
And the day that I saw him, he had just been harvesting all of his oranges, and he's got a small orange orchard, and he had them all in the back of the car, and he was headed off down to an army base to hand over all these delicious oranges. Another friend of mine who's 90 was using his private car, and he was ferrying prescription medicine. So people that were running out of asthma pumps or out of whatever they needed, their blood pressure tablets, their family would get on a WhatsApp group, and then he would go and pick it up and go and drop it off. There was, all this civil society activity was amazing to see, and everybody that I met was somehow involved. In these old friends of mine in their 80s and 90s. I mean, literally, they were walking up straight. They had a new holding, a spring in their step, and you could see that they were feeling that they were part of something.
Fantastic.
And that was something. When I saw it, I felt really amazed, and this, in circling back to where I started, I think that Israel's resilience as a society would not have been possible. When I think about many Western societies, where people don't have the training, they don't have the initiative, they don't have access to weapons.
Yes.
I know it's possible to say, well, they don't live next to Gaza, but as someone who lives in quite close proximity to some pretty impressive concentrations of close cousins of the people who live in Gaza in the north of England, I wouldn't be so complacent that it's not necessary for a society to have that resilience. And I just think that the lessons that we can learn from Ukraine, how they've managed to hold out. I mean, we all know at the moment that they are faltering, that they are struggling, but they have held out longer than anybody thought. The Israelis have managed to bounce back from this catastrophic intelligence failure, where once again, they sort of bought into what they call the concept, where the whole Israeli elite thought that they knew how Hamas thought. They thought that they understood the threat, and their intelligence failure based on the concept failed exactly the same way as it failed at Yom Kippur. So what a lot of Israeli friends of mine were saying, we have to confront the fact that our state, our high-tech, technocratic state has got some fundamental flaws when it comes to identifying enemies, how to deal with enemies. And that's not really surprising because, as you well know, asymmetrical warfare is a challenge. And it's specifically designed to find the weaknesses and the flaws in the structure and hierarchy of an established state.
Yeah.
So it's hardly surprising that when you are hit, you always are going to be hit in the place where you're weakest.
Yes.
And it's not going to be with, a tank brigade or a bomber fleet. It's going to be, as we now painfully know, with a commercial airliner or a fishing boat full of explosives or a drone that's been bought on the internet and repurposed,
Yes.
or a whole lot of um, peroxide that was sold to hairdressers in the UK, which ends up making a bomb, or
Yes.
a fertilizer bomb with
Exactly.
30 tons stolen from agricultural supplies.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you're going to fight an asymmetrical war, your greatest resilience comes from having a different kind of a population that has the ability to organize itself and respond in the way that the Israeli general population has. I think that for the Israeli government, they now face a problem, because I think that part of this process of going soft
Mm-hmm.
and losing control that is happening in modern technocratic societies,
Yeah.
people forget that they can look after themselves. They forget
Yes.
that they know how to stand on their own 2 feet. A short,
Yes.
sharp shock like this here resets that relationship. And I think
Yes.
that in Israel, the Israeli government going forward are going to find two things: that ordinary civilians are going to say, hang on a moment, you
Mm.
screwed up big time. You got everything wrong. And when we
Yeah.
needed you, you weren't there. So
Yeah.
in this, famous social contract, which Locke described, where
Yeah.
you as an individual make a contract with the state, and you hand over your power, and then they look after you. You've
Yes.
broken the contract, state.
Correct.
So we are taking it back. The other thing is that before this year, all the military veterans were on the street protesting against the government.
Mm-hmm.
I think that will be dwarfed by the way that the new veterans,
Yes.
the hundreds of thousands of young Israelis who see
Mm.
hard combat for the first
Mm.
time, are going to come back and say, hang on a moment, we've been into hell and back, we've
Yes.
looked into the abyss, and we now have the right to have a bigger say about what
Correct.
happens in the future. And I think they are going to quite bluntly tell the older Israelis, you've had your moment,
Mm.
you got it horribly wrong, you
Yeah.
misread the situation, you've taken us down a dead end, and there's going to be fundamental change. And I think it's a good thing, because as I said to you the other day, I'm seeing indications that in some of the Gulf states,
Mm.
where a combination of affluence, technology, and education
Yes.
is leading to younger people who are more secular and less enamored with the sort of medieval death cult,
Yes.
which bedazzled the older generations. I
Yes.
think that those people have an appetite for change, and that
Mm.
there's going to be much more in common with a young Saudi who went and fought as a conscript against the Houthis, or a young
Yes.
Emirati who went to fight in Yemen as a conscript, and a young
Yes.
Israeli, secular Israeli, who fought in Gaza as a conscript. And as you and I know, people who come back from war have a lot more in common with one another, even if they were enemies, than they
Correct.
have with many people in a civilian society. So I think
100%.
that I'm being optimistic, and I think that when this is all over, I absolutely believe, and you very rightly described this as a sort of a criminal syndicate. It has to be eradicated. It has to be completely removed. And Israel needs to be given space and time, and afforded the same kind of space that Western countries got. I saw this great interview the other day where someone from Deutsche Welle was
Mm.
berating one of the Israeli army spokesmen, because
Mm.
he had quite correctly said that a ratio of one combatant to two civilians killed was a
Mm.
remarkable achievement. And this guy was saying,
Yes.
this is morally outrageous. How can you say that? And the Israeli guy shot back and said to him, well, as far as I know, the German army were involved, well, police in Afghanistan, you were part of NATO, the civilian casualty ratios were between 9 and 13 to 1.
Yes.
So, just don't get self-righteous with us.
Exactly.
This is an exceptional achievement, and I am proud of it, because a 1 to 2 ratio compared with Afghanistan, compared with Iraq. But obviously there are these intolerable levels of self-righteousness, of hypocrisy amongst so many people in Western society. They're not giving the Israelis credit for the fact that they are fighting an incredibly surgical war against Hamas, and that they need to finish the job, because if they don't finish the job, it will be the same thing that happened with Iraq after the first Iraq war, where there was a lack of resolve. Republican Guard escaped. We ended up in another war. And Israelis need to finish the job, and then they need to use all of the genius that they have, all the brilliance that they have, all the people that they have, like my friend Soshan, who are experts in a reconstruction of African countries and South American countries. They have to try and find some way to help the Gazans to build a proper functional society. So, John, I apologize if I've spoken a lot and not given you much time to ask me questions, but I'm very open to questions. I just wanted to sort of map out this interesting thing that I've seen, where you've got a threat, you've got two societies that have something in common, and how they've managed to survive that threat and do relatively well against it, and then ask the question, are those of us who live in societies which don't have this inherent pluralism, which don't have this inherent resilience, how do we prepare ourselves for a similar situation?
Okay, Philip, there's so many things as you're talking that my mind is spinning, and I think we're going to have to, you and I are going to have to speak again about some of these topics. But just to sort of pull it back a little bit and just give you a sense of what I'm thinking, and if you'll respond. So you're speaking quite a lot about what some people are calling the cultural war in some ways. It's this clash of ideologies. I mean, you and I both know the history of East versus West and all that kind of stuff. So I think we're at that sort of fundamental existential kind of level that comes from 712, the year 712, current era, and that's been continuing since then. I mean, right up to War of the Roses, 1636, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is a continuation of that war. And I think that people who don't have an understanding of the breadth of history and the region and what have you really battle to understand that. And this dispute over the name of the country, whether it's Palestine or not, and where it comes from, what have you, to me is really, it's a silly dispute, because it's a way more complex and way more nuanced situation. I think that's important. But where it informs what I'm thinking about is a comment that you made about the control. You mentioned control. And the thing that strikes me is that there is this balance between a free society where individuals are in control of their own destiny and can make their own choices, and a controlled a society or system where the government can impose certain things on society for the best interest of the society. And to me, those are very often in conflict, because if the Israelis had to say, we've got conscription, that's a major element of control and a major issue of resentment from a number of Israelis that I've met, that it's this burden. I mean, we had the same thing in South Africa, is this idea about the draft or the conscription, what have you. You do it because you have to, because you do it under threat of duress. So the one is, it's a free society. I must be able to choose what I can do and be resilient as an individual. But on the other side, it's the state says, but you want certain things, such as security of borders and all the rest of it. So we're going to impose this really arduous experience on you. And it's that conflict that I see that plays out in things like, they kind of feel arbitrary when we're talking about this topic, but directed speech, political correctness, using the right terminology for the right sort of things that people say that you have to do it, and compelled speech and all of those kind of things. And you've got to sort of look at that in the context of what's happening now, because we're talking about the generation that you're talking about, that people like you and I look back at it and say, this is the TV generation, the couch generation. Physically, they're not as capable because they haven't done it. They are visually driven by false influencer type things, people that have filters on so they don't even look the way that they do in real life. The concern about what do we trust because of AI. So there's all this stuff going on. Okay, so and this has been in my mind, and we touched on this briefly when we chatted the other day, and over our various discussions that we have late at night. And what I'm thinking about this, and I'd really like to hear what you have to say, because it's been intriguing me. The sense that I get from the Israeli people, or the Jewish people that live here, or back to Africa that I'm in communication with, is that this moment for them is a reset. This is the Warsaw Ghetto. This is the moment that inspired the Never Again. And so I'm curious to what extent all of this culture war, all of these things possibly can be overridden. And I'm interested, if you give me a second, I'm interested to hear what your impressions are from actually visiting Israel now, and a sense of people around you. Just to give you a little bit of a sort of a sideline. So we've had some Europeans coming through here, mostly girls from Germany and Switzerland and what have you. And I listen to the way that they talk about stuff. And there's a particular framework that they've been taught. And if you try and introduce any issue that is outside of the framework that they know, they shut down. They have been, not that they don't have the ability to think, or they don't, but they have been taught not to think about those things. And here's a stupid example. There was the one girl who was adamant that female lions are the hunters and that male lions can't hunt. And this was about girl power and all the rest of it. And I said, that's not really true. No, it absolutely is. I said, well, yeah, here's a Google search. Male lions hunting. And I sent you a link to a Google search that was the top 10 videos of male lions hunting. And she looked at it and said, oh, they're just aberration. So there was this serious cognitive dissonance that she literally wouldn't accept that what she'd been taught to reinforce her particular ideology, that the facts didn't matter to her. Okay. So I'm curious to know whether this has been enough of a shock within the Israeli society to overcome that resistance and to reset the way that they think and that they approach things. Because that, I think, is fundamental to how they go from here.
John, it's a very interesting topic. And I mean, I've had a long time to think about conscription.
For sure.
I'm a lifelong libertarian. I read my first copy of Ayn Rand when I was 14 years old. And
sounds very familiar.
As a libertarian, I'm very, very suspicious of anything to do with the state.
Yes.
And the nationalization of your right to live and die is a huge issue for me. I mean, it's something that I deeply resent, the fact that most Western states don't allow you to take your own life.
Correct.
In a sort of, it's something that's a huge issue for me. So, it's only fair then that they should be, I should have some huge issues with conscription. And because of our South African experience, I thought about this a lot. I also come from a family who are deeply religious, who had a strong anti-conscription, certainly in combatant role, philosophy rooted in their religious beliefs, which I found myself in very strong conflict with. I think the Israelis have got their conscription system about as well refined as you can. And let me explain to you why. The first thing is that a lot of the Orthodox Jewish people don't do conscription at all. They're excused conscription.
Yes.
And this is obviously like my family. They also have this problem with serving in a combat role, and they are excused. And the really ethical ones choose to serve in that special unit that deals with all the blast victims after terrorist attacks. Those are all, they do that, and I take my hat off to them.
I admire that.
Been in proximity to enough bodies and dead parts in my life to know it's something that it's not easy to do. Then also they've got these very special units. So autistic people, they've got special military units for autistic kids.
Yeah.
And they use them literally as human computers. They've got all kinds of ways in which they accommodate people, and they make sure they do an enormous amount of psychometric testing.
Yeah.
So they are not serving in an army like perhaps you and I were, where if you had a degree in political philosophy, you were regarded as an excellent potato peeler. I don't think they have that. They actually try very hard to use people in the best place. They also have got a very powerful incentive scheme for people to sign on for short service contracts, which takes a lot of the strain off the system. And there is no equivalent in Israel of the 10 years prison sentence that there was in South Africa for complete refusal to serve.
Yes.
As far as I'm aware, they don't have that. So they do have a much more flexible, open-minded. And I think that from speaking to older Israelis, they try to force some of the religious fanatics to come into the army. And they just created a mayhem. They didn't want to be there. There was a lot of obstructionism. And the last thing you want are people serving alongside you who really don't want to be there.
Yes.
So I think they've got that balance. When it comes to decisions which a state makes, there's been a fascinating topic raised. I don't know if you remember, there was this Israeli Mossad agent called Pollard, who was arrested for spying on the Americans and sent to prison for a very long time. The Americans were furious that Mossad was spying on them, and they locked him away for, I think he originally got a life sentence and it was eventually commuted. But Pollard was saying, and he's started a furor in Israel, that he thinks the government were wrong because they should have declared a state of emergency. And he said they should have placed all the hostage families under a complete curfew.
Yes.
And made it a criminal offense for them to say anything about the hostages.
Yes.
Because obviously all the noise that they've been making, all the activism, all of the attention that they've generated has provided a level of complexity to the political situation, to the negotiations, and also, given that Israel has a record of exchanging 1,000 prisoners for one Israeli soldier, it's made already a difficult task much more difficult. So Pollard was saying if he was in charge, he would have shut them up and sent them to prison if they didn't listen. Now, obviously, if you've ever been in Israeli society, the only thing I can say is that Pollard obviously spent too much time in an American prison, because if he thinks that you could lock up that number of Israelis and keep them quiet, well,
not a chance.
It wouldn't happen. But Israel has obviously decided that in this balance between liberty and freedom and the national interest, and this really is the national interest, because I fear that because of the way that the hostage issue has been handled, Israel will end up paying a really big price in terms of
Yes.
releasing people who shouldn't be released. But then I
Yeah.
think at the end, a lot of the men will be killed by Hamas,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
there'll be a huge amount of grief and trauma. So when you look at a modern democratic society that has the rule of law, there are all these very, very difficult decisions about where you draw those lines. And I think that's what you're alluding to
Mm.
with the question that you asked me is how do you in this hyper woke world
Yeah.
where people are every day inventing new rights,
Yeah.
um, rights for every sentient creature on the planet.
Mm.
How do you maintain a cohesive response to sorry, excuse me, to a
Yes.
major threat?
Yeah.
Um, it's not easy. I mean, it's those German and Swiss kids that you're encountering that have been taught not to think.
Mm.
That conditioning process starts extremely young.
Yes.
And the way you inoculate children against that is by doing the kind of things that a Victorian society did, like scouts and
Exactly.
guides, where they took
Mm.
children, irrespective of whether they were rich or poor.
Yeah.
They put them in a uniform which didn't allow them to differentiate themselves between how rich or poor they were. So, they couldn't show off their Nike sneakers or their superior track top because they all looked the same.
Yes.
And they were taught values and they were taught ethics and they
Mm.
were put into a situation where they had to work together. They had to understand one another, irrespective of what their cultural and social backgrounds. Unfortunately, all of that stuff is out of fashion. It's
Yeah.
been dismantled. It's been corrupted.
Yeah.
So our Western societies need to find some way of rediscovering an acceptable template for
Yeah.
a community service that
Yeah.
brings young people back into some kind of service to the community. That's sufficiently asymmetrical and sophisticated that it caters for all the differences in people.
Yeah.
And yet it still, at the end of the day, brings everyone into a situation where they understand that there's a bigger society, a bigger, a greater good that
Yeah.
comes from collaborating. And I say that as a libertarian, not because I want to see the Hitler Youth recreate,
Yeah.
but I want to see a situation where, individual kids are taught those things about individual liberty
Mm.
that are about respect for life and property, the things that
Yes.
were all part of the whole scouting,
Yes.
guiding ethos.
Yes.
And we have to find a new way of
Yeah.
doing it. It may be hybrid. It may be part online. It may be part
Yeah.
virtual. It may
Yeah.
be part real. But we don't have anything like that at the moment. We
Right.
actually have a vacuum, and so we're not shaping people. And as you know, the poor people, the instructors,
Mm.
and the leadership cadre in all of the armed services in the West, who are grappling with the products of this year
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
intakes of new recruits. I just
Yeah.
hear horror stories from them because
Yeah.
they are dealing with people. I mean, we served alongside people who wore their first pair of boots when they came into the army. Some who didn't
Exactly.
know how to eat with a knife and fork. Some used to
Yeah.
wet their beds.
Yeah.
But they've got a whole other level of magnitude when it comes to people who are just completely unprepared. And these are volunteers who are
Exactly.
unprepared.
Sure.
So it's a very important issue which you're raising, and one which I'm so acutely aware of because I'm privileged to spend a huge amount of my time in what I call the undeveloped world or the third world or whatever you want to call it. But countries where children are still going to scouts and guides. I mean, you'd be amazed. Countries like Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, even Zimbabwe have all got a very, very active scouting, guiding culture. They've still got these things that the West has already abandoned. They still exist in Africa, and they enjoy huge support. And they're huge numbers of young people going through them. They're learning those core societal values that are so important. And of course, it's interesting. I remember in after 1994, I was a senator in the South African government, and there were older senators from the ruling party who had been in exile, served in MK, had been trained in the Soviet Union, and there was the whole debate about what happened to school cadets.
Yeah.
And I remember being astonished because the most enthusiastic people for the retention of school cadets were the old MK veterans. And it was a motley coalition of younger people from all the parties who wanted it scrapped as a militaristic, proto-fascist, thing that had to be rooted out of schools. And I remember some very, very senior MK commanders warning them and saying to them, you shouldn't be breaking this down. South Africa is going to need, every school needs to have a cadet assistant. Every young person, rather than breaking it down, we need to spread it to everybody, and to boys and to girls. And of course, nobody listened to them. And now, sadly, we see the consequences of that. Western leaders would do well to actually think carefully about how you go back to doing that. If you need to maintain the core values that you need for social cohesion, you can't just descend into this place where we are now, where young people's value systems are shaped by TikTok and
no internet connection.
I don't know, a bewildering variety of digital influences which don't contribute towards them learning how important their role in society is, and this mutually beneficial interaction that they have. I really get the feeling in Israeli society that they still understand this here, and they're putting a huge amount of effort into this here. And I was amazed talking to some of the young daughters and granddaughters of friends of mine who are currently serving. Most of them choose to do a year where they do a community service in the army as part of their preparation for their 2 years military service. So they actually go and work in poor communities, amongst street children, with Bedouin families, and helping recently arrived immigrants to integrate. And this year actually helps them to prepare both for their service, but also makes them much better citizens when they come back from the army.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that answers your question.
Well, yes. What I've observed here from some of the Israeli people I've spoken to here, and also some that I've spoken to in South Africa, is an absolute support of the Hosky rescue. There's no doubt that is 100%. Hamas must give up the hostage. Then the secondary level is from a lot of them, there is a lack of understanding about, when people talk about proportionality, what they're referring to is the International Law of Armed Conflict. It's a very precise legal sort of concept that people don't understand, and they don't understand what it means to have things like a non-military target, such as a mosque or a hospital, becoming a military target because of the way that the enemy behaves. There's a whole bunch of criteria for that, which we don't need to go into. So in the beginning of this, there was horror, shock horror, do whatever you need to do. And then within about a week or so, it kind of morphed into, but even though we want the hostages back, is this the right way to do it? The Palestinian sort of movement across the world is saying, ceasefire and what have you. And a bunch of Israelis were like, maybe that's the way to do it. And as the time has gone by and more of the footage has come available, and more of the details become available, I'm getting a sense that the Israelis' position is hardening. Especially, there's one friend of mine who's very liberal woman who's a Jewish convert married to a Jewish guy, and her son's over there, and he's stationed in the north at the moment. And I started getting questions from her about, I'm putting a package together. What should I send her? And that was like the support about, I'm supporting my son and his friends and what have you. And it slowly morphed to a point of, I'm getting my husband to take me to the range so I can brush up on my firearm skills so that I can actually go there and do it myself. And I'm watching this hardening coming from the Israelis in response to this overwhelming, not only anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitic it's a difficult term, and there's anti-Zionist, and there's all these kind of terms, but it's the sense of a national identity. And you and I both know that there's been this move to vilify the whole concept of nationalism, of country first, of closed borders, and your citizens' rights first, not refugees, and all of that kind of stuff. And what I'm watching in a very small way is this kind of hardening of attitude. And I'm guessing, and this is what I was hoping that you might speak to, is that just what your impression is. Catching a taxi, riding on the train, walking around the street, what you kind of feel there is a general thing about the resilience, the morale, and fortitude and resilience of the ordinary Israeli person.
John, firstly, it's very complicated because, as you know, Israelis are often very different. Certainly those that are second and third generation Israelis that have grown up there. They're culturally very different from the diaspora Jewish communities that you encounter in Australia, South Africa, UK, America, which again have their own unique characteristics. And I think one of the sad things that I'm seeing is that because Jewish populations in Western countries as ethnic minorities have experienced lots of problems in the past with nationalism directed against them, so host country nationalism. I think that proportionately a lot of left-wing Jewish people have historically been very anti-nationalism, and academically, a lot of the people that have written and thought about what a danger nationalism is are actually Jewish. That's historical reality, and it's linked to the terrible treatment that they've received all over the world. And I think it must be very painful for them now to have to confront the fact that their only refuge is nationalism, because that one place where they can go where nobody questions who they are, irrespective of what they look like or what their level is of devotion, that is closely tied to their national identity. So there is this very painful thing playing out in all the diaspora communities at the moment, where people who have been very left-wing, very anti-nationalist, are now having to come to terms with the fact that the communities that they fought so hard to be recognized in as part of a multicultural, rainbow coalition with no strong national identity, that they're under threat from another minority.
Yeah.
And so how that ends up is going to be a very interesting. I don't take any sort of pleasure from seeing that people being caught in that very uncomfortable contradiction, but it is something that some Jewish people have been warning left-wing Jews about for a long time.
Yes.
And they've been very outspoken, people within the Jewish community who have highlighted this risk. People like Melanie Phillips, who have warned people on the left. So one almost looks at those people with the sort of sadness, people losing their innocence. Well, they are losing their innocence, and they're having to confront the fact that they are up against people who just have a different view of their right to exist. And there is a difference between the sort of casual, ignorant anti-Semitism of a lot of people in the UK that I meet, who are just ignorant, and the anti-Semitism it's sort of cultural. It comes from the church, and it's ignorant. And then people who viscerally hate Jews, and actually, as all the polling has shown here in the UK by independent people like Trevor Phillips, the former head of the Equality Commission, when he did the sort of deep polling of Britain's Muslim population, he found that the deeply held anti-Semitism in a sort of pathological sense existed with between 70 and 80% of British Muslims. So this is something that I don't think that they chose to confront. I don't think the wider society chose to confront. No one wanted to accept that we had a vulnerable minority and we had an emergent minority, and that the one hated the other one so much that they actually believed that they should be exterminated. And we swept that under the curtain, under the carpet. I think that Israeli sentiment, proper Israelis, I think it's very hard at the moment. It's very, very determined. I've never seen such absolute resolution to take this thing through to its final stage. There are a couple of problems. The one is that, for better or for worse, Israel is hugely dependent on America. And in a strange way, the fact that the Americans actually have so effectively come out in support of Israel has been a great thing for Israel, but it also creates an extreme vulnerability. Because I was listening to someone, a commentator last time, who was pointing out that under President Biden, the last time the Israelis went into Gaza, day 1, he supported them. Day 5, day 10, day 15, day 19, he supported them. And they were emphatic that they were going to finish the job. Day 20, White House podium, Israel has to leave. The war is over. Day 21, Israelis had to stop. And they did that against every single, bone in their body was telling them that they had to finish the war. But so that's the one thing. They have that vulnerability that the minute Biden loses his nerve, and it could be any time because he's under huge pressure from within his own party caucus, that they will face an ultimatum to stop. The other thing is that they face another existential threat, because I think all of them understand that the real war is not with Gaza, it's with Hezbollah and with Iran. And at the moment, all the people I spoke to said to me that they are impressed with the extent to which Nasrallah is keeping his cool, and he's identifying as a Lebanese first and as an Islamist second. That is true, but it is also true that Hezbollah is actually waging quite a hot war against Israel in the north.
Yes.
There's a lid on it. The world is choosing to play it down. But every single day there are mortars, shells, missiles, and increasingly anti-tank missiles fired across the border. And the reality is that all the northern settlements have had to be evacuated.
Yes.
And there's probably 35,000 Israelis, because the north is not heavily populated, who are currently internal displacees. So for Israel to return to normality, they have to resolve the issue with Hezbollah. And there again, every Israeli says it has to happen. We can't live under the sword of Damocles forever. There was an agreement that the United Nations were supposed to enforce, that all of the armed factions withdrew north of the Netanya River. And there was supposed to be effectively a demilitarized buffer between southern Lebanon. Now, that was never done. And the UN forces who are there are doing what UN forces are so good at, with all respect to those of you who have served in them, is they are not enforcing that mandate. So there is a problem, and unless there's some kind of intervention to persuade the Lebanese, who have a very, very weak control over Hezbollah, to actually force them back, the chances are there would be an escalation. So, in terms of how hard Israel's internal attitude is, I think it becomes academic, because if the balloon in the north goes up, they're going to be mobilizing another 100,000 people, and it's going to be full war. And that's horrific for Israel, because their economy is obviously tanking. Because you've got all these economically active people out of the economy. The other thing is that they have no effective defense against 10,000 missiles fired simultaneously or in salvos out of other. So that there's no, what's the right word, militant war hunger in Israel at the moment. They're just quietly determined.
That's what I was
they're ashamed of their government for failing. They're proud of their army. They're desperately sad about what happened. But I think you and I have spoken before about this thing that every single person that either survived the Holocaust or has family who have survived the Holocaust, who I've spoken to in Israel, tell me the same story. They tell me that that they feel a deep sense of confused shame about their predecessors who walked to their deaths in the death pits of Ukraine, the forests of Poland, the gas chambers of Central Europe, and who didn't fight back. And they all believe that this thing of dying on their feet rather than on their knees is so central, viscerally central to their identity. And I don't think that's just rhetoric with them.
No,
I think really they mean it. So that's what I see, and they have a social cohesion which is unusual in the modern world.
Okay, so all that being said, we've spoken about the army in the general sense. We've spoken about Israeli society that is quietly determined, that definitely are united around the idea of hostages must return, Hamas must end, in a general sense. Fractious like siblings in a family can be, but united in terms of a united front to the exterior. I mean, that's all of that is being said. I don't know if you want to talk about this, so just tell me if you think it's off the table. But one of the issues that has come up that somebody has speculated about is the possibility of the Putin involvement, and the fact that there's over 100,000 odd Russian Israelis, and that they're a potential fifth column, or some of them, or the potential source of a fifth column within the country, etc. Do you want to talk to that? Do you have some ideas, some thoughts on that?
John, it's a very sensitive area. I think that, let me just say this much, that there's a lot of good reasons why Putin would want to play in his master chess game that he's playing. And it is a master chess game. That he would want to considerably divert and split Western support away from Ukraine at the moment.
Yes.
I believe very strongly that what we are seeing in North Africa with the destabilization that Wagner is undertaking has very little to do with natural resources and mining and mercenary contracts, and everything to do with creating waves of refugees that put pressure on Europe. Putin showed that how skillfully he managed to manipulate the Syrian conflict to literally dislodge an avalanche of refugees into Europe, and he created enormous strain, social, security, every level strain on Europe. He has shown in the way that he pre-positioned himself before Ukraine, using gas prices, using trade deals, that he almost got it right to completely neutralize the Germans. And there was a real chance in the beginning that Germany wouldn't actually actively support a Western backing for the Ukraine. It's not beyond his ability, or it wouldn't be inconsistent with his understanding of how to fight the West, that he would use his very close relationship with Iran, and Iran's very, very effective proxy spectrum of proxy organizations, ranging from the Houthis to Hamas to Hezbollah to their Iranian assets that are operating in Syria. That it's a very low cost, very low risk strategy for Russia to pin America down into supporting Israel in a very, very clever asymmetrical attack. I think there's a strong possibility, and I've heard that speculation amongst Israelis. It's, of course, the one thing I will say is that it's a clue to how complicated it is if you look at how careful Israel has been about supporting the Ukraine. Because there's been obviously there's been a lot of debate in Israel about supporting Ukraine. And Netanyahu has consistently said that it's not in Israel's national interest to antagonize Russia. And they've cited their vulnerability in Syria. But I think that there's a bigger issue at stake, because Israel, in the same way that India has an independent relationship with Russia, even though India and Israel are Western allies, I think the same applies to Israel. And that's partly through vulnerability. Because the Israelis know that they're vulnerable. And they also know that whereas Russia or the Soviet Union was the first country to vote for the state of Israel in 1948, since then they've done everything to bring it down. At every single war that has been fought against Israel
Mm.
has been with Soviet weapons
Correct.
and Russian advisors. So
Correct.
it's a very difficult area for them, and one which they're deeply conscious of. And I think that they are caught up in the superpower Game of Thrones, which is unfolding.
For sure.
And
for sure. Okay, no,
that's
thank
the
you.
reality of where we are.
Thanks, Phil. I mean, that makes sense. It is speculation, and you see all kinds of speculation about various things. And that one just occurred to me as being a broader sort of concept. And I think it's important what you said is that it illustrates the complexity. I think if you don't have anything else, maybe some concluding thoughts, and we can wrap this up, and then we can pick it up on another time where we can speak about some of the things I really would like to address with you, like some of the things you've done in Africa and some of the projects you've been involved with. So some closing thoughts from you, and we can shut this down.
John, just a sort of a feeling that I really strongly have, that the West is seeing the early stages of its own intifada.
Yeah.
And that it's not something that any Western government, including the US government, who doesn't understand that this is a wider issue than just Israel, and that Israel is the tip of the spear or the trip line for the West.
Yes.
I really believe that. And then the other thing is that in the UK, in the last 18 months, there has now finally been a formal designation by the state, by the security services, of Iran as an enemy of the UK. And there's a state of sort of non-military hostility between the two. And that's because of the clear evidence of Iranian hostile activity on British soil. Intelligence, assassination, abductions, intimidation, front organizations, the full spectrum of Iranian operations are and have been present here. And I think that what we will see is the Iranians use the coalition of pro-Palestinian forces, including those that may be legitimate and those that are just puppets of the Iranians, but that they will try to use them to generate and mobilize much more pressure. And I think that as the Israelis get closer to closing Hamas down, you're going to see an acceleration of activity on the streets.
I watched an interview yesterday with Michael Douglas, who was saying about in the UK that if he was in power, the very first thing he'd do is he'd start, deporting certain people. And he mentioned some very important people that were one guy who was a Hamas military, senior military officer, who's been granted citizenship in the UK. And he makes the point that why, when part of the application for citizenship is that you're a person of good character, and if you're a member of Hamas of that level, then you're clearly not. So I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm seeing these other things, and I'm starting to hear some voices speaking up, very lone voices at the moment. Him being a very good example of someone who's quite vocal and has a platform. To say, let's actually apply our laws and not be scared of the political backlash, the social backlash. I'm not quite sure what. And it's not, excuse me, it's not make new laws. It's not do things illegally or badly or unfairly. It's the people who are clearly don't meet the criteria for being legal immigrants to our country need to leave. And I'm slowly starting to see that. I mean, we've seen the elections in the Netherlands. We've seen the elections in South America with more libertarian / inverted commas right wing. which I think is the beginning maybe of the pendulum swinging. And it's not even the pendulum swinging. I think it is a realization that while the ideal is X, Y, and Z, the reality is before we can get to the ideal, we need to deal with these things in a pragmatic way. And maybe there's like a glimmer of hope about these things across the world actually being solved in a way that is not necessarily, nuclear winter generating calamities. So let's be positive about that. I see a glimmer of hope in that. I know that you agree with that.
I certainly do, John. And I think that for me, my greatest fear as a libertarian is the big lesson that I learned, and it was a brutal one. I supported, Bush in the second Iraq War.
Yeah.
And I was an enthusiastic supporter of going into Afghanistan. But on reflection, I'm one of those people who has become deeply cynical about the manner which the state used those events to entrench and roll out its power and its authoritarian hold within our societies.
Yeah.
Exactly. So the last thing I'm calling for, is a restriction on freedom of speech. I personally don't believe in hate crimes.
Yeah.
I don't. I mean, I like you and I, we grew up in a world where we taught sticks and stones don't break my bones, or break my bones, but words never harm me. And I think that you're absolutely right. Britain has got some good laws. It's also got a couple of new laws which need to get boosted out of the window, but it's got some good laws. And if those laws were properly applied and people showed some rigor and a backbone, they could contain this here. And if people wanted to protest about Palestine and they did it within the confines of normal political discussion, protest, no one would have a problem with that.
100%.
And I think that it's important, because if you close that down, the consequence in this country will that there will be a populist, authoritarian, deeply right-wing government, which will be the last thing which we need, and the last thing which society needs as we try and go forth into a very uncertain moral maze of trying to navigate our individual rights versus artificial intelligence. So, I hope that there's a tightening of control so that it stops that populist backlash. And everybody I speak to, I try and emphasize to people on the left that they've got every reason to want to see that happen. If they value freedom, they value liberty, then you need to stop that backlash. And the way to stop the backlash is to be fair and equitable, and for the rule of law to work.
Exactly.
And that's not happening at the moment. It needs to happen. So that's where I'd like to leave it.
All right. I think that's a fantastic place to leave it. Once again, thank you very much. We'll definitely speak again. And
thank you, John.
I think some food to thought, and I really appreciate it.
It's been a great discussion, and thank you for welcoming me into your garden.
It's a pleasure.
Have a good day, John.